The Japanese invasion of the Philippines was conducted on schedule. The first landing was made on December 8th.
Year 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on December 8, 1941. Just 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's when the war began. The Japanese came out with a statement, "For every Japanese soldier that dies, 10 Filipinos will die."
People of the Philippines, I have returned.
A hundred of Filipinos went up the hills carrying suitcases and guns, but what they are really armed with was guns.
For every Filipino that dies at the hands of the Japanese, I will kill 100 Japanese soldiers.
Good afternoon, everyone. For today's lesson, we would try to pick on the historical events that happened during World War II. And what better way to do this is by providing you this creative presentation themed as Netflix. It would seem as if you're only watching a movie, so sit back and relax, maybe get a pen and paper, and let's venture to the past. Here are the names of the members of this group. Now let's take a look on the events that happened in the midst of World War II in the Philippines during the Japanese occupation. The topics that we would try to discuss for today would comprise how the Japanese attack happened and the establishment of the puppet government, the fall of Bataan and the rise of the guerrilla warfare, the Hawks, the return of the Americans and the recapture of the Philippines, and lastly, how our country rebuilded from the ravages of the war. Let's discuss first a little bit of a background about the American military government. The American president appointed military generals to govern the territory. It lasted for about 3 years during the Philippine-American War. Those 3 military governors were General Wesley Merritt. He is a Union cavalry officer and first military governor of the Philippines. General Elwell Otis. He was a United States of American general who served in the Philippines late in the Spanish-American War. And General Arthur MacArthur, who was the father of Douglas MacArthur. Suppressed nationalism has been depicted by nationalist historians as an era dominated by the repressive policies and actions of the American imperialist regime, as the new colonial masters forcibly imposed their will upon the now conquered Filipino people. Among the laws that was promulgated by that time is Sedition Law of 1901. It was passed on November 4, 1901, imposing death penalty, long prison term, or sky-high fine for those who would dare write, speak, or fight for independence. Even works of art with hints of independence advocacy were suspected. Another one is the Brigandage Act of 1902. It was passed on November 12, 1902, legally labeling those Filipinos still fighting for freedom as bandits and robbers. Reconcentration Act is American policy that kept Filipinos within a militarized zone to keep them from aiding Filipino fighters. Disease and starvation, dislocation and death for many Filipinos were the result of this American containment policy. The Flag Law of 1907 is an act to prohibit the display of flags, banners, emblems, or devices used in the Philippine Islands for the purpose of rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States, and the display of Katipunan flags, banners, emblems, or devices for other purposes. The United States, like Spain, could not draw the best and brightest of its countrymen to the Philippines because most American leaders were indifferent to the new possessions. This apathy created problems for colonial officials faced with perpetual shortages of personnel. They were ultimately compelled to set aside racist assumptions about Filipino capability and speed up the tutelage training. When we say tutelage, it means guardianship. Once they had judged the war a lost cause, they looked for a way to come out of it with their wealth and status intact. One clear way was to take up the American offer to help govern. Furthermore, the electoral system proposed by the new American state would heavily favor them. The conversion of Filipino elites to the American side has its qualification. First, you should be male aged 23 years old above, who is residing in the municipality where they were to vote for a period of 6 months immediately preceding the elections. He should belong to any of the following 3 classes: can speak, read, and write English or Spanish, own a real property worth at least 500 pesos, or have held local government positions prior to the occupation of the country in 1889. The Partido Federalista is the first generation of Filipino leaders under the American regime. They were the established elites who turned away from the revolution, and it was created in the 1900s. The Federalistas were publicly committed to the Philippine autonomy under the American colonial mantle, although most of its leaders privately hoped for the Philippines' takeover to the United States. Partido Nacionalista is formed in 1907. They were publicly advocated eventual independence under the protectorate of the United States of America. It is composed of revolutionary veterans, former Katipuneros, intellectuals, elected provincial governors, appointed local judges, and members of the urban middle classes. Having abandoned armed resistance, the new generation of Filipino leaders masters the rules to the new colonial game to take advantage of the rights and powers available under American tutelage training.
Now that we have a short introduction regarding the American government, let us talk about the Japanese attack and the establishment of puppet government. The Japanese planned to occupy the Philippines as part of their plan for the Greater East Asia War, in which the Southern Expeditionary Army Group seized sources of raw materials in Malaya and Netherlands East Indies, while the combined fleet neutralized the United States Pacific Fleet. Japanese invasion of the Philippines had 3 objectives. First, to prevent the use of Philippines as an advanced base operations by American forces. Second, to acquire strategic areas and supply bases to enhance operations against Netherlands East Indies. Third, to prevent the lines of communication between occupied areas in South and the Japanese islands. With that being said, Japanese launched a surprise attack on Philippines on December 8, 1941, just 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Initial aerial bombardment was followed by landings of ground troops, both North and South Manila. The main attack began early in the morning on December 20 as 43,110 men of the 48th Division and 1 regiment of the 16th Division, supported by artillery and approximately 90 tanks, landed at 3 points along the east coast of Lingayen Gulf. Japanese conquest of the Philippines is often considered the worst military defeat in United States history, as about 23,000 American military personnel and about 100,000 Filipino soldiers were killed and captured. Now that we have mentioned the Pearl Harbor, let's briefly tackle what it is. Pearl Harbor, a day that will live in infamy. When we say infamy, it means it is something that is brutal act. Pearl Harbor, a naval base in Hawaii, USA, that served as a docking station for the entire US Pacific Fleet. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise military strike by Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service upon United States against the naval base on Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, territory of Hawaii. It served as docking station on the entire US Pacific Fleet that is just happened before 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, December 7, 1941. So what happened in that event? There was almost 200 Japanese warplanes attacking the base, and the casualties were 2,300 American killed and 1,100 American wounded. A total of 18 warships were sunk or heavily damaged, including air battleships. The day after that attack, US declared war on Japan, which followed Germany and Italy, declaring war on US on December 11.
Good afternoon, I am Mika Orfano. And for the continuation, let's go on to the establishment of the Puppet Republic. On December 26, 1941, after the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, President Manuel L. Quezon, the second President of the Philippines and the first President under the Commonwealth, had declared Manila as an open city, as seen from the sample photo. Open city means a city declared to be unfortified and undefended by the international law except from an enemy attack. Quezon was advised to go to Corregidor because of the threat from the Japanese, and it is also to spare the city and its inhabitants from damage and harm. He left it under the rule of George B. Vargas as the representing mayor. As being said that Manila as an open city, the Japanese entered the city on January 2, 1942 and established it as the capital. Later on May 6, 1942, Japan fully captured the Philippines after the Battle of Corregidor that also fell into the hands of the Japanese. At the outset of the occupation, the Japanese government established a military administration over the Philippines, as well as the Philippine Executive Commission composed of several pre-war Filipino political leaders. The Kalibapi, o ang kapisan ng paglilingkod sa bagong Pilipinas, and the sample photo was their logo during that time. Kaya kung makikita po natin sa logo na ito, parang may mga taong buhat-buhat ng isang bahay kubo. At ito'y sumisimbolo sa bayanihan. Na siya nga namang nasa dugo na nating mga Pilipino, hindi ba? Kaya tinayo ang organisasyon na ito para sama-samang ipaglaban at makamtan ang kalayaan para sa Pilipinas. Also, it was a movement designed exclusively for the Filipinos. It is composed mainly of Benigno Aquino, Pio Duran, and Camilo Osias. Jose P. Laurel was also made as the Commissioner of Interior that time, wherein he is responsible for the games and amusements. Fast forward on June 16, 1943, a year after the recapture, Prime Minister Hideki Toho a soldier and statesman who was the Prime Minister of Japan, promised independence to the Philippines. This started the hope of many Filipinos for their desired freedom. So, the Calibapi formed the Preparatory Committee on Philippine Independence, or the PCPI, which was tasked with drafting a new constitution that was approved on September 4, 1943 by the Japanese government. The Japanese then noticed Laudel's charms to the Filipinos. That's why they decided to create the Co-Prosperity Farce, or Pakikianib, with the PCPI, allowing a transition of leadership from Japanese to Filipinos. So, by the popular vote, Jose P. Laurel became the President of the Philippines under PCPI on September 25, 1943. This honor of independence was granted by Prime Minister Hideki Toho to win the loyalty of the Filipinos. And on October 14 of the same year, in the ceremonies in front of the Legislative Building in Manila, the new republic was inaugurated. And Jose P. Laurel, the said president under PCPI, officially became the president of the Second Philippine Republic, or the Japanese-sponsored independence, also known as the puppet government of the Philippine history.
After Japanese-sponsored independence was granted to the Philippines by the Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Toho in January 1943 to win the loyalty of the Philippines, Jose P. Laurel became the second Philippine Republic president, and he took his oath as a president in Tagalog, and during his presidency, he was able to build strong ties with the Japanese before, during, and after the war. He was also known as the collaborator, or the puppet president, where the puppet government came from. And because of the controlling Japanese people during the war, and most of the people felt that the government was a puppet government, and many did not take the republic seriously. Because of the food from merchants and from producers were confiscated by the Japanese, men were being forced to work in military bases, and people who are accused of supporting guerrillas and being pro-Americans were being arrested and tortured. So then, Jose P. Laurel focused his interest to the Philippines and the Filipinos. He first focused on the food or the poverty of the Filipinos, the residents from Manila and other cities, and took various steps to solve food problem. He reorganized the rice control agencies. He gave farmers more recognition and raising the government's buying rice, and he increased the food production. In addition to that, the cause of crisis is the shortage of fuel and transportation. He then establishes the basic accommodation, which is the inflation that leads to creating special courts to try profiteers. He increased penalties against those who unjustly raise prices, and he raised government salaries, among others. We are aware that Ferdinand Marcos, during his presidency, he declared martial law. But the first president who officially declared the Proclamation 29 or the martial law throughout the Philippines is Jose P. Laurel in September 21, 1944, and it became effective September 22, 1944. So let us discuss or let us recall what martial law is. So martial law is a state where particular area or the whole country is under the control of the military or armed forces. He also declared a state of war between the Philippines and the US and Great Britain under the pressure of the Japanese Premier Hideki Toho, where it became effective September 23, 1944. However, the declaration was not effective because of the two reasons. Number one is that the president did not submit the war declaration to the National Assembly for approval, and the president made it clear that the Filipinos would not be forced to serve in the war. And after he declared the martial law and the state of war between the Philippines and the US, the martial law was eventually lifted on August 17, 1945, and after the bomb attack of America to Japan, the Japanese surrendered, which is also the end of the presidency of Jose P. Laurel, the same year as 1945.
Now, let us proceed to the fall of Bataan and the rise of the guerrilla warfare, the Hooks. But before that, let's discuss first the background of the Bataan Death March. So, in the year 1941, December 8, the Japanese invasion in the Philippines has begun. The day after the Japan bombed the US naval base at the Pearl Harbor, and it is marked as the official entrance of the United States in World War II. So take note that during that day, December 8, 1941, dito dineclare yung World War II. During the invasion of the Japanese on the said date and year, the Philippine resistance to provide the impetus or yung kilasan ng maliliit na grupo ng mga untrained, unorganized communist rebel or sila yung mga magsasaka na tinrain to be an effective guerrilla force. This guerrilla force was the Hukbalahap or Hukbon ng Bayan laban sa mga Hapon.
First hit the hospital in Baguio. So this brings fear to the wounded and the sick patients. So you can even see the human flesh dangling on the trees, and the limbs are almost everywhere. So those are the arms, the thighs, no? Now, Wainwright, okay, for those who don't know Wainwright, so he is the commander of the 2nd Corps. So in the Bataan battle, so we have the 2nd Corps and the 1st Corps. So the 2nd Corps are the one who are in charge in the west, and for the 1st Corps, they are the one who are in charge to the east. So the 2nd Corps in the west was in disaster, and Parker's 1st Corps in east, so Parker is the commander of the 1st Corps, who is, even though they are intact, you know, they were already in full retreat, so gusto na nila umatras. So, equipment was being put to the torch. So, ayun, sinisira nila yung mga gamit because they don't want the Japanese to use this against them. and then what they just left are the vehicles, but even the vehicles are not moving. So on April 9, 1942, U.S. General Edward King and his forces weakened. And then later that day, saying that further resistance will be hopeless, King reached out to the Japanese, and then he had this meeting with Major General Kamichiro Nagano. So this is the Major General. And so then King asked if he can withdraw his troops from the Bataan, but Nagano refused. And so, he asked, will our troops be well treated? But then the Japanese lied. No? Parang sinabi dito ni Nagano, yes, parang, anong akala mo sa amin? But then, the next day, he surrendered the forces on Bataan. They have surrendered to the enemy's superior force and numbers. And so, on that day, April 9, 1942, the Bataan fell according to the voice of freedom. So this is broadcast by the 3rd Lieutenant Ildefonso Reyes by recording the message that was prepared by Captain Salvador P. Lopez. So Captain Salvador P. Lopez is a creative Filipino writer. And so this is what he said. Bataan has fallen, but the spirit that made it stand, a beacon to all the liberty-loving people of the world, cannot fall. And so, the military operation of Bataan lasted 93 days, for about 93 days or about 4 months after the departure of this USFIP to the Bataan. And so, American and Filipino forces sustained around 10,000 killed and 20,000 wounded, while the Japanese sustained approximately 7,000 killed and 12,000 wounded. So in addition to the casualties, US FIP lost 12,000 American and 63,000 Filipino soldiers as prisoners. So there are 75,000 in total. So those suffering from the combat wounds, disease and malnutrition, so these prisoners were marched. So even though they're suffering from those, malnutrition, disease, lack of sleep, they march for about 65 miles para makarating doon sa camp. And then, this is what we called the Bataan Death March. And so, lacking food and water, so the prisoners were beaten or stabbed if they fell behind or were unable to walk. And the thousands of US FIP prisoners died before reaching the camp.
And now we're going to the aftermath of the Bataan Death March. The fall of Bataan to the Japanese that happened in April in 1942, the guerrilla warfare carried on the fight for the occupation period. And the occupation period was last from 1945 to 1952, so it took 7 years. And the Hukbalahap organization proved highly successful as a guerrilla group, and they killed many Japanese troops. And on October in 1944, after the America has invaded the island Leyte, as we all know, Leyte is located at the island Visayas. So nagpunta sila doon para mag-avenge or para maghigante sa pagkatalo nila sa Pilipinas. And bago din pala mangyari yun, nag-promise si General Douglas MacArthur na I shall return. Yung line na yun is very famous as napag-aralan na natin siya sa mga past history classes natin. And that was happened in the year 1942. After that, the Bataan Peninsula was regained by the US Filipino forces in 1945. Bukod pa dito, na-free na din yung Maynila bago mag-march din nung taon na yon. After makalaya ng Pilipinas sa war, the military tribunal in the US or the United States, si Lieutenant General Homa Masaharu, he is the commander of the Japanese invasion in the Philippines, and he was sentenced to death by the firing squad. And yun na nga. And that was the death march that happened on April 3, 1946.
Next, we will talk about those socialist, communist, and anti-Japanese rebels that originated from the central part of Luzon, which is the rise of guerrilla warfare, the Hooks, or the Hukbo ng Bayan laban sa Hapon, and how did they rise during and after the war. So as you can see on the slide, the term guerrilla is coined in the term romantic thrill. So what does it mean? So let me explain. So within the rise of the Hooks, the term guerrilla has some interpretations or views that are associated in a kind of romantic thrill, in which it means that it attracts younger recruits who are worn down by the hardships of survival. So also, in general context, when we say guerrilla, it is defined as the member of an organized group solely consists of peasant or farmers. So bottom line here is that the term guerrilla are not only justified by its usual definition as soldiers or rebels to fight against the Japanese, but they have the romantic thrill na kung saan sa kabila man ng kanilang estado sa buhay bilang isang magbubukid o manggagawa na mulat sa pakikibaka at nakaranas ng hindi makatarungang pamamahala sa kamay ng mga dayuhan, isa yun sa mga rason na nag-udyok sa kanilang layunin na para sa kanilang mga kaanib sa iisang hukbo at sa ikatatagumpay ng Pilipinas ang laban na kanilang ipinamalas. Next one is the constant issue, securing food and ammunition. So in line with this matter, during the Bataan Death March and the weeks before the surrender, securing food and ammunition is a constant issue. Because during this time, they were suffered in which the lack of necessities did not encourage them to surrender. Dahil alam ng mga guerrilla na hindi kailanman magiging sagot at hindi kailanman magiging balakid ang kakulangan ng armas at kakulangan sa pagkain upang mapagtagumpayan nila or masurvive nila yung laban na nasimulan. So next, Luzon guerrillas were not strongly motivated by those ideological concerns. So what do we mean by ideological concerns? So those concerns or ideological concerns are forming a new government, because guerrillas were focused on establishing moderately stable conditions in order to survive and coordinate stranded soldiers effectively rather than forming a new government. Kasi hindi naging madali sa mga guerrilla ang dagok at pasakit na kanilang tinamo. Bagkus hindi nila hinayaang gumawa ng sariling pamahalaan dahil mas nag-iigting sa kanilang mga puso ang layuning mailigtas ang kapwa nila sundalo sa pagkakabilanggo at mapagtagumpayan ang laban sa pamamagitan ng pagsalakay sa mga kalaban upang makuha ang mga armas na kanilang gagamiting sandata sa mga mananakop at patuloy na pausbungin ang kanilang hukbong itinatag. So lastly, General Masao Baba, which is the chief of Japanese counterintelligence, planned a large operation. So what operation is this? So as guerrilla power increased, the Japanese became more aware of their existence as well as the American leaders who led them. So after that, Colonel Akira Nagahama, which is considered as the head of the Kempeitai or the Japanese military police, assigned General Masao Baba to find the guerrillas. So sa pamamagitan nito, ang layunin kasi ni General Masao Baba at ni Akira Nagahama ay patayin o litisin ang mga guerrilla at mga Amerikanong namumuno upang ang mga kasaping Pilipino ng mga Hapones ay magkaroon ng karampatang pabuya na kung saan pinangako yon ni General Masao Baba bago niya palang ipautos yung operasyon na gusto niyang gawin. So bottom line here, in the rise of guerrilla warfare, the Hooks or the Hukbo ng Bayan laban sa Hapon is that no matter how the Japanese suffered the Hooks and the guerrilla, the Hooks still remain and continue to fight for what they deserve and to continue the legacy of their movement despite of their social status. They did a big part in shaping the history of the fall of Bataan, the Bataan Death March, and most importantly, in World War II, due to their continuous battle against the Japanese until their last breath.
Return of Americans and the recapturing of the Philippine Islands. So, as you all know, Japanese was in control of Philippine and Hawaiian Islands by 1942. So it happened specifically in May 6, 1942. So, by December 1944, an U.S. Army captured the Mindoro and the Leyte First, establishing two airfields. So, why do you think was the reason the Japanese recaptured only the Philippines and the Hawaiian? Because their islands can be made as their place for their aircrafts and the machineries that they need for their colonization. So, from the Japanese era, which is 1942, it ended up 2 years after, which is in December 1944, and the recapturing of the US happened. So by January 15, 1944, smaller invasion took place southwest in the Manila. So before this, in December 1944, the smaller invasion happened in Mindoro and Leyte. Then specifically, there is a place called Lingayen Gulf, and that was the first place that the US recaptured. Next is February 4, 1945. So the 1st Cavalry Division, or the major invasion of the US, entered in the Manila. So they hold 4,000 civilians as their hostages for this recapturing in Manila. So this is the start of the liberation of our prime city, which is the Manila. So the declaration of the liberation of Manila finally took place at March 4, 1945, which is 1 month after the 1st Cavalry Division entered our city. So next is the surrender of the Japanese. So from March 4, 1945, the liberation of Manila took place up until July 1945. Then the surrendering of the Japanese in September 3, 1945. So why did the Japanese surrender? So basically, one of the major reasons why the Japanese surrendered is that the casualties, or the number of the casualties, becomes bigger. Let's say in Americans, the casualties is only 10,000 people and wounded soldiers, while in Japanese, they acquired almost 130,000 casualties between this Japanese and American war. And finally, the Independence Day. So Independence Day is in July 4, 1954 or 1964. So finally, Independence Day. So our Independence Day was on July 4, 1964. So our Independence Day happened because US finally accredited, and take note that our country is an independent country that can have government of itself. Finally, they give out full independence to the Philippines rather than the half independence which was given by the Japanese in our country.
It seems as though that a lot of events really took place during the war. Now, let's identify those personas behind the events in World War II. I am sure that you all know some of these people that I will be introducing to you. Some of the most popular people in World War II is Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, and of course, Douglas MacArthur and Homa Masaharu. So first, let me present to you Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. He was among the few U.S. military leaders aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay when Japan signed the surrender documents ending the World War II. He was known for the nickname Hero of Bataan when he was lauded for defending the Philippines when they were overtaken by the Japanese. Wainwright was the 4th Army's commander in the Philippines when the US entered World War II. In 1942, he became senior field commander of U.S. and Philippine forces and was tasked with defending the islands. The battle for the Philippines was hard fought and spanned several months. U.S. troops faced starvation, disease, and rough jungle conditions after being cut off from supplies. Despite being advised to leave, Wainwright was authorized to continue the fight from the Bataan Peninsula. He fought alongside his men and often visited the front lines of the battle. The Philippines fell to the Japanese on April 9, 1942, but Wainwright and thousands of others survived and escaped to Corregidor, the last Allied stronghold in the island chain. There, they hid and dodged air bombardments for another. He finally surrendered the island to the Japanese on May 6, 1942. He and the remaining Allied troops were forced to join the Bataan Death March to prison camps in the Philippines and on the other Japanese-held islands. Wainwright considered himself a failure because he had surrendered Corregidor, but in September 1945, he was promoted to 4-star general and awarded the Medal of Honor. He received a hero's welcome when he returned to the United States. And yes, those are some of the information about Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. So now, let me tell you a short introduction about Hama Masaharu, a person that was discussed earlier by my groupmate. Hama Masaharu was a lieutenant general and he led the Japanese invasion of the Philippine Islands. He was the one responsible in mopping up actions against stray U.S. and Filipino forces in the Visayas and Mindanao areas. He was formally charged with having been responsible for the Bataan Death March when the war ended. Right after the war, the military tribunal in the United States, Lieutenant General Hama Masaharu, was sentenced to death by firing squad for the Death March on April 3, 1946.
On slide 34, I'm going to talk with Douglas MacArthur and talks about after the Pearl Harbor attack, Army General Douglas MacArthur was forced to flee the Philippines capital of Manila ahead of a Japanese invasion. MacArthur and his family and members of his staff fled to Corregidor Island in PT boats and escaped to Australia. And of course, Douglas MacArthur was a descendant of an American Civil War hero, worked with the Second World War as U.S. military chief consultant in the Philippines. After the Pearl Harbor attack, he was forced to flee the Philippines capital of Manila ahead of a Japanese invasion, so he and his family and members of his staff fled to the Corregidor Island in PT boats and escaped to Australia. On the next slide, General Douglas MacArthur wades ashore into the Philippine islands of Leyte. Fulfilling his promise to return to the area, he was forced to flee under orders from the President Franklin Roosevelt in 1942, thus his famous phrase, "I shall return." And on the next slide, talks about how, in quote, "I have returned by the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again in Philippine soil." And only the third of the member MacArthur left behind in March 1942 survived to see his return, wading ashore in Leyte. Once again, when he came back, he announced, "I have returned by the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again in Philippine soil." In December 1944, he was promoted to the rank of General of the Army and soon given command of all of Army forces in the Pacific. On September 2, 1945, MacArthur officially accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The 14,000 feet long tunnel known today as Malinta Tunnel in Corregidor Island has served as MacArthur's headquarters and a U.S. supply depot. The blast killed the bulk of the Japanese as well as 52 Americans, and many Japanese who survived were thrown.
So in here, we will now be discussing about how the Philippines rebuilded from the ravages of the war. So we all know that Manila is known as the Pearl of the Orient. So it was a city of decaying corpses, contaminated water, and stone rubble when the last Japanese left the city on February 29, 1945. And those Filipino families who had collaborated with the Japanese occupiers feared that the Americans would put them on trial. So they had grown up under a Commonwealth, and created by whom? Of course, created by President Roosevelt in 1935 to provide transitional governance from colony to future independence. As you can see in the first picture, it is under the Commonwealth, wherein the Philippine leaders had copied the US political institutions, their laws, and many of its liberal values. And their admiration for America was intense. But when Japan invaded in 1942, they witnessed MacArthur retreat from the Philippines. And when the war ended, intense debates surrounded the role that the Ilustrados or Filipino elite should be playing the future governance of their nation. In the second picture, it is actually the post-war challenge, wherein facing both MacArthur and the Filipinos was who should lead their country toward independence. And upon his return to Manila, the exiled Commonwealth President, who, of course, Sergio Esmeña, sought to reinstitute the American pattern of education and expunge all remnants of Japanese indoctrination. Okay? And he proposed the creation of the People's Court to investigate all Filipinos suspected of disloyalty or treason, and he issued a victory currency to stabilize the economy. Okay, so in his mind, Philippine independence should arrive on August 13, 1945. But the US Congress, however, postponed the date for Philippine independence by 11 months. Okay, so the Philippines was the first Southeast Asia country to gain independence after World War II on July 4, 1946. Well, in the third picture, it was determined to complete the promised independence. So MacArthur ignored complaints that he relied upon the Ilustrados, whose loyalty during the war was questionable. Instead, he looked for men who could govern, who could invest, and who could rebuild the country. So in here, Rojas was installed as President of the Republic of the Philippines under the auspices of the United States and undertook the immense task of rebuilding a war-torn nation that had many severe problems even before the war began. After World War II, the Philippines endured crippling high-interest loans under the guise US aid and its society and infrastructure. So, including more than 3/4 in schools and universities laced in ruins. So in here, to help get war-devastated nation back on track and sever its own self-interest, the United States what? Of course, the United States gave the Philippine economic aid in return for 99-year leases on military bases and free trade privileges. So all the industries dependent upon the American trade protection would face total or partial liquidation. Okay? So the wages and living standard could be lowered. Why? To reduce the cost of production. But they could not be accomplished without unemployment and hardships to millions of people dependent upon these industries for livelihood. Because such as those situations will invite social unrest, chaos, and of course, disorder. Finance Secretary Hernandez, speaking on behalf of the Filipino members of the Rehabilitation Commission, he proposed that existing trade relationships be extended for how many years? For at least 20 years. Okay, so we believe Hernandez said. And that 20 years is the minimum time that would enable us to make the needed rehabilitation. He said, the reconstruction and the adjustment of the industries that are now dependent upon the American market. Okay? So, under the Filipino proposal, existing trade relationships would remain in force beyond the 20-year period unless either the United States or the Philippines gave the 5-year notice of desire to modify or terminate them. Between 1946 and 1972, the Philippines was governed according to a constitution modeled after the American one. So the fact that the United States kept its promise of independence to the Philippines after World War II. So they put some pressure, especially to the Europeans. Why? Because they want to do the same in their colonies. So in here, the recovery began as soon as military liberators began to retake the country. So the army engineers of the conquering US military restored or enhanced the strategic infrastructures. Why? Because the supply lines could be reestablished. Okay? And this improved transport and communications, which at least encouraged resumption of economic activity, began to alleviate existing conditions. Philippine demands for early independence seem to many observers to be extremely ill-advised at this time. So why? Because the former High Commissioner MacNutt, gave public expression to this view when he warned the Filipinos that independence would inevitably weaken their appeals to economic assistance and of course to their trade preference. So according to him, we may have to let the Philippines take their freedom now, and learn the hard way. Okay? It is more than possible that if they get their freedom now, they may never again attain their pre-war economic stability and may destine themselves to a permanently lowered standard of living. So it's according to the former High Commissioner MacNutt. Thank you for listening, and we will now proceed to our next reporter, Mr. Adrian.
Reports on the extent of war damage in the Philippines are still incomplete and to some extent contradictory. Estimates of total property destruction range from as low as $750 million to as high as $1.5 billion. According to some reports, the Japanese have carried away all heavy machinery in the islands and burned whole villages and productive areas. Restoration of mechanical equipment in the island will be difficult. However, the economy is basically extractive and agricultural. Permanent damage to productive resources may therefore be relatively small. Destruction has been most intense at Manila. George E. Custer, construction engineer, estimated after an extremely sketchy survey that damage from fire, demolition, and shelling would reach perhaps $750 million. Army engineers are reported to have estimated total damage in Manila at $1 billion. 300 ships, including 62 vessels of more than 2,000 tons, were sunk in Manila Harbor. One of the Army engineers has estimated the destruction of Manila bridges might run to $20 million. All of the buildings of the University of Manila and many other school buildings were damaged or destroyed. Damage done to Philippine property between December 6, 1941 and July 1, 1942 will be paid for by the War Damage Corporation under provision of the War Damage Act of 1942. The War Damage Corporation will be authorized by a pending bill of Senator Taft to reimburse private property owners in the Philippines for war damage suffered since July 1, 1942. The corporation will be authorized also to make a complete study of the damage to public property and to recommend measures to restore such property. Rehabilitation of private productive properties in the Philippines also depends to some extent on congressional action. Passage of the TAP bill would supply financial aid for the construction, but entrepreneurial interest may hesitate to restore their properties, particularly in sugar and coconut production, unless assured of more favorable trade preferences in the American market, and for a considerably longer period than the provided by existing law. Philippine War Damage Commission, or PWDC, was set up to administer the rehabilitation program by the United States and the new Philippine Republic. The commission was composed of 3 members. 2 of the officials, the chairman and a member, were appointed by the U.S. President. The 3rd member, a Filipino, by the Philippine President. Frank Waring was the American chairman and Francisco Delgado, the Filipino member. The Philippine Trade Act of 1946 confined the Philippines to a subservient position in exchange for the American payment of $800 million to rehabilitate war damages. The United States required that the Philippine Constitution be amended to give Americans equal rights with Filipinos to own mines, forests, and other resources without giving Filipinos equal rights in the United States. The insult of this so-called parity agreement was compounded by the requirement of unlimited free trade for 8 years and the demand that the Philippines peg its currency to the US dollar. Furthermore, Filipinos were prohibited from selling any products that might come into substantial competition with articles made in the United States. This means that the manufactured goods such as textiles, rum, and rope were prohibited, thus stunting industrial production and commending the archipelago to agricultural and raw material production. Heated debate over that trade agreement, also known as the Bell Act, roused questions over the sincerity of independence, but so weak were the citizens of the archipelago in the post-war years that dependence on American financial support became indispensable. Additionally, enduring the social inequity forced by many of their young to immigrate and work abroad as overseas workers.
And it's a wrap. That's it for this episode, and we hope that you have learned something from us. Stay tuned for the next episode as we would now be discussing about the birth of the Republic.